Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today is a very exciting day for me because we're finally bringing my favorite and the most important topic in crochet garment making to my YouTube channel, gauge. Across my social media platforms and here on YouTube, we will be spending the whole month of March deep diving into all things gauge, why and how we do it, how to get it perfect every time, how to account for growth due to blocking, and implications in gauge and size inclusion. Additionally, I will be updating the existing 5-part blog series I have on gauge with all my most up-to-date and comprehensive knowledge on gauge. At the end of the month, I will also be hosting a workshop on how to use gauge to modify existing patterns to your wants and needs. The link to sign up is in the description below. Here's how it's going to work. Each Saturday in March, I'll be releasing a YouTube video on a certain topic within gauge. And each day on Instagram, I'll be highlighting a smaller, more specific tip that will be included in the video released the prior Saturday. Follow along here on YouTube, on Instagram, or sign up for my weekly email newsletter list via the link in the video description as we demystify all things gauge related and build your confidence in using gauge to get garments that fit. Today's video is just a basic introduction to gauge, what it is, why it's important, and the difference between gauge and swatch, and some other things you should and should not be doing. Next week, I'll teach you how to make and measure your swatches. I'll teach you to know when and how to make flat swatches or in the round swatches, and 2 different ways to make in the round swatches. On week 3, we're going to talk about adjusting your gauge when the gauge is incorrect so that you can get it perfect every time. Week 4 will be all about blocking your swatches, why and how to do it, how to measure your gauge as you're making your garment, and how to calculate expected growth due to blocking your garment. Then in the final week, week 5, we will have a discussion about gauge and its implications in size inclusion. With that being said, let's hop into today's introduction to gauge. If you would prefer this in blog form, I do have that 5-part blog series on the topic already, which is linked in the description below. What items do we need to do gauge? You will need the yarn that you want to use for the project, something to measure your gauge like a gauge square or a ruler or a tape measure, and then you'll also need a variety of hooks near the size listed in the pattern. You should also have some yarn or wool wash and water for blocking your swatch. Yes, you need to block your swatches. More on that in week 4's video. Now, what is gauge and why do we do it? Very basically, gauge is the size of our stitches. Every single person crochets slightly different than the next. We hold our hooks differently, we tension our yarn differently, we sit differently while we crochet. The smallest things can affect gauge in a big way. The type of yarn or fiber we use to make something can also affect the size of our stitches. Acrylic, wool, alpaca, cotton, superwash, bamboo, etc. all have slightly different structures and all create stitches that are slightly different, and the fibers wear and block differently. But don't let that scare you. You're always welcome to use a different fiber than the designer. You just need to swatch in your chosen fiber. Another fiber-related thing that we don't often think about that can impact our gauge is the material our hooks are made of. Wooden hooks hold yarn differently than metal hooks, which hold yarn differently than plastic hooks. Also, the taper on the head of the hook can also impact your stitches. Now, you don't need to use the same hook as the designer. You need to use whichever hook gets you accurate blocked gauge. Additionally, some designs have 2 different gauges listed because 2 different stitch patterns are used in the garment. For example, I listed a gauge for both the cuffs and the body of my Kaya sweater scarf. While I used the same hook to achieve both of these gauges, many of my testers did not. So even from one stitch to a different stitch, your gauge can vary from the designer. That being said, you can use whichever fiber and whichever hook you like for your garments, but you cannot use whatever weight of yarn you want. In order to achieve a similar drape to the pattern and to achieve the same gauge, you must use the same weight of yarn. If the designer used DK, you need to use DK. I often get questions asking if someone can use a different weight of yarn than me, and then how to adjust the pattern to that different weight of yarn. But it's not that simple. You can't just go up or down in size or just add or subtract a few stitches and hope that you'll get the same result like the designer's sample. Gauge is all about proportions. So if you change the size of the stitches and the weight of the yarn for a dynamic piece that fits your dynamically shaped body, it's just not going to work. Not very easily, and not without completely redoing the math for the stitch and row counts. Why do we gauge and what could go wrong? If your stitches are bigger than the designer's, even by a little bit, you will end up having a finished piece that is bigger than the designer's intended. If your stitches are smaller, then your finished piece will be smaller than intended. Now, while this might be okay for a scarf or a blanket, for a hat or a sweater, something that's going on our body, we want our sizing to be as accurate as possible. For example, let's say the designer states the pattern gauge is 10 stitches by 10 rows in a 4x4 inch or 10 centimeter blocked swatch. If you decide that 9 stitches by 9 rows is close enough and proceed to make a sweater, you're going to run into trouble. So let's say the sweater has a finished measurement of 50 inches with accurate gauge. If you make the sweater with your 9 stitch by 9 row swatch, you will end up with a sweater that is almost 56 inches around the bust, which adds almost 6 extra inches of ease than the designer intended. This will also impact things like where the neckline sits on your body, how the sleeves fit your upper arm, and the length of the body and sleeves, just to name a few. Now the opposite will happen if you were to work a gauge of 11 stitches by 11 rows. The finished sweater would only measure 45.5 inches in circumference, making it 4.5 inches smaller than intended. This is why we need our gauge to be as precise as possible. Now let's talk about what the difference is between the word swatch and the word gauge. Aren't they the same thing? No, they are not. In short, a swatch is the little piece of fabric you create to test to see how your gauge compares to the designer's and to achieve the same gauge as the designer. Gauge is the actual number of stitches in rows in either a 4-inch 10 centimeter or 2-inch 5 centimeter square. Your swatch, the piece of fabric you make, should be at least 1 inch wider and 1 inch taller, therefore more rows and stitches than the gauge in the pattern. This is because as we crochet more stitches, we get into a more natural rhythm, and the foundation chains and turning chains at the sides of our swatches can impact the stitch size. In next week's video, I'll give you a formula for determining how many stitches and rows you should be making in your swatch in order to best achieve accurate gauge. In summary, gauge is the number of stitches and rows in any given 4-inch square, and swatch is the little piece of fabric you make to test your gauge. Over time, you'll get to know if you are generally a tighter crocheter or generally a looser crocheter or somewhere in the middle. And maybe you'll even get to know how your gauge typically compares to your favorite designers so that you can know if you need to size up or down your hooks in order to get your gauge correct. And that's everything for the intro to gauge. Make sure you like and subscribe and come back next week to learn how to make your flat and in the round swatches in 2 different ways. And if you're interested in learning about how to use gauge to modify, I have a workshop coming up 2 different times, March 30th at 11 a.m. and April 2nd at 7 p.m. You can sign up below. See you next time.